Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your patience. I have to explain that this is like the second last week of the semester, which is why it's leading up to the exams, and we were expecting a lot more people than this, but I think the students have a lot of end of semester quizzes and assignments due, so some of them may have signed up and decided that they had to study. But nevertheless, I'd like to get started, please. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hannah Yifan Lim, and I'm an associate professor here in the Nanyang Business School in the Division of Business Law. I'm also a NIST Impact Fellow, and on behalf of NIST and NTU, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's talk by Professor Dame Wendy HALL. And we wish to thank the British High Commission in Singapore for making today's event possible. For those of you who may not be aware, NIST is actually the NTU Institute for Science and Technology for Humanity, and it is a collective of researchers, students, industry professionals, policymakers, and members from civil society. It aims to design a future society through responsible, interdisciplinary, team research by integrating STEM and non-STEM expertise and methods. NIST prioritizes public participation and co-design with partners and informs governance and policy making towards solving societal challenges. NIST addresses societal challenges through transdisciplinary team research, combining the latest science and engineering with key domain knowledge from the social sciences, humanities, business, and the arts. It brings together researchers with very different research backgrounds and they discuss the important questions the world is facing. We are indeed very privileged today to have with us Professor Dame Wendy HALL. She is the Regius Professor of Computer Science, Associate President of International Engagement, and is an Executive Director of Web Science Institute at the University of Southampton. She became a Dame Commander of the British Empire in the 2009 UK New Year's Honours List and is a Fellow of the Royal Society. Dame Wendy was co-chair of the UK government's AI review, and she was appointed the chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute and joined the BT Technology Advisory Board in January 2021. She co-authored the book Four Internets with Kieran O'Hara, published by Oxford University Press, which I believe she will be speaking on today. Her co-author is an Emeritus Fellow in Electronics and Computer Science at the University of Southampton. And the book explores the original Internet vision and outlines the resulting alternatives that have evolved over time. Now, that concludes the formal and institutional introduction of Professor Dame Wendy HALL. I would like to take the moderator's prerogative and give my own personal introduction of Professor Dame Wendy. And at the risk of revealing my vintage, when I was a student in a double degree program of computer science and law at the University of Sydney in the 1980s, never did I dream that I would actually meet face-to-face in person the person whom I believed revolutionized the internet. Now, for many people, the internet may be synonymous with the World Wide Web. But for those of us who are trained in computer science, or those of us like me who actually lived through the development of the internet and the World Wide Web, we know that the internet has actually been around for a lot longer than the World Wide Web. And I think many of us today take for granted all the hypertext links that we click on every day, right? I mean, we click on probably hundreds of these hypertext links every day. But back then when I was a computer science and law student, all this was very new and very exciting. And because it was a very non-linear approach of the hypertext links to access information and to connect with information, and it was this trajectory of computing and computer science that was actually very revolutionary at the time. So I would like to share, I think it's an open secret, but just in case it's not, I would like to share that Professor Dame Wendy was one of the pioneers who invented and developed the concept and the science of hypertext links in the 1980s, and upon which the World Wide Web was developed and built in 1990. And I'm actually very proud to be one of the very first users of both the hypertext linking system and the World Wide Web before it was released to the general public in 1991. So let me just put it in summary if you didn't understand anything I just said just now. In short, Professor Dame Wendy and her team, if they had not invented the hypertext linking system, I'm not sure whether we would have the World Wide Web as we know it today. And so without further ado, let us put our hands together, warmly welcome Professor Dame Wendy HALL to enlighten us with her recent research. Thank you.
That was possibly the nicest introduction I've ever had. Can you send me that text? I'd love to. Would you mind? I'm a bit overwhelmed. You actually brought tears to my eyes because I don't usually get introduced like that, and that's really kind because you were there and you knew what we were doing. I don't claim to have invented the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee did that. But I did help pioneer the whole concept of hypertext. What, is something wrong, ladies? No? Oh, I see. Did you get the speech on video? I'm going to move over here. Yeah, okay. I could see. You should have just said, right? I was a bit overcome by that intro. Thank you very, very much. Especially as you were doing computer and law in the 80s. I mean, that was pioneering too. There's several things I want to say. One is that I just arrived last night, and I actually flew from New York to London to here. So it's 20 hours flying and, 13 hours jet lag. And I would also like to say that I'm here courtesy of the British High Commission, Han Bin Zeng sitting there. I've known him for a while, the British High Commission. They introduced me to NIST. And I'm very pleased to be here, even if your students aren't. And also I want to say, that you will know this, that what we do at the Web Science Institute is incredibly close to what you do at NIST. Let me just explain that a little bit and then I'll start into the talk. Because I've been to NTU, it's been my pleasure to come to NTU several times. Last time I came, Vanda here, Vanda or Wanda? Vanda, yeah. I recognised her immediately. She was there to greet me getting out of the van, the car. We went to the Hive. I was hugely impressed, and it's stuck in my mind for all those years. Before COVID was the last time I was here, obviously. I've come to NTU many times, and I was just asking Vanda, the NIST started in 2018, and I haven't, it's my first opportunity. I didn't know, because I haven't been to NTU. You might have talked about it in future plans, but I haven't been here before. So it's a real pleasure to be here because we founded the Web Science Institute in 2006. When I say we, that was myself and Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Shadbolt, Danny Weitzner, who's a lawyer, because we realized that the World Wide Web, which was by then about 15 years old, needed studying from an interdisciplinary perspective. Because this thing we talk about, the internet, the web, they may be driven initially technically, but it's what we do with them, what we, society, does with them, that determines how they develop and how these things develop. This ecosystem that we have co-constructed with the technologists, without, that's like with the computers, if you like. We have the networks of society and the networks of computers interacting with each other without either understanding what the other's doing. And I'll tell you some of that story in this talk, in the book we've written about. So I won't repeat that now, I'll just go into it. But the key thing is the need to study. You called it transdisciplinary. It could be multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but it has to be studied from a transdisciplinary perspective. And that's what we do in the Web Science Institute. And we called it the Web Science Institute because we were building a new science of the web, which we were meant to be a science of connected systems. So we're going through a bit of a name, well, not necessarily name change, but we're rebranding a bit so people don't think we're all of the past. But it's very much, our aims and objectives are the same as you're doing here, so we should talk some more afterwards about that. So do I need to keep holding this? Yeah, okay. Shall we just, maybe if I sit, let me see if I can sit down. Because the tiredness may overcome me a bit. Oh, no, I don't know. Can someone hold the chair while I get on it? Oh, right. Hi, right, now, how do I get the slides?
You can use this if you like.
Oh, is that what you want me to do? So just... Down for up. Okay. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Now, the other thing that went right or wrong today is when I switched my computer on this morning, it was dead. So having flown 20 hours with me, and Hanbin and I were searching for slides to use. I had a set to use, and they were on my computer, couldn't get at them. So what I'm actually using here is a slide set that I got by email while I was on holiday in New York from my co-author, Kieran O'Hara. And he's put some new stuff at the end, which is really cool. So that'll work. But it is a set of slides, the end of which I haven't talked to before. But otherwise, I think we're fine to go. So it's a slightly different title to what you had advertised. Right. So let's assume here we all understand the internet is the network of computers, and the World Wide Web is the software protocols that run on top of the internet of computers. Do you know that the TCP/IP, the protocols that Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn invented in nearly 50 years ago, it's 2024, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary. Both gentlemen are still alive. Well, I know Vint Cerf's alive and kicking. I think Bob is too. He's not quite, he's a bit older than Vint. But there'll be a big celebration in 2024 for the development of the internet protocols that the world really runs around. You know, they make the world, they make things happen. And trying to imagine life without the internet as we know it is very difficult. So I argue, and I'll say this again at the end, that protecting the internet in one way or another is incredibly important for our futures, just as much as climate change or how we manage all the futures. It's a really important topic. It's also amazing how many people in the world don't realize that there's a network of computers and a network of software and a network of people, that they're all, it's a hierarchy of networks, if you like, that we're dealing with here. And people talk about the splinternet. That's Eric Schmidt. Sorry, Jane lag gets to your brain. The former CEO of Google, talking about the splinternet, and think it's as simple as that we talk about the internet fracturing because of the differences between the way it runs in the US and the way it runs in China. We argue it's much more subtle than that, much more complicated, and that's what the book and this talks about. We'll see as we get to the end that it's really quite impossible China is the only country in the world that could actually split away from the global internet and run its own internet and not worry about the rest of the world. Nobody else has that power. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And it's all to do with ideologies and cultures. And that's why it's so important to talk about this in Singapore, because you are really where those cultures mix so much. And we have seen, now we published this book, we wrote the first draft, the first white paper in 2018 or thereabouts. We actually published it in the middle of COVID in 2021, when all the books were caught up in the on the ships that couldn't dock in the harbours. It was a really boring launch because nobody had any books to sell. So it was, and we couldn't go and talk about it anywhere except online. So anyway, but it is a network of networks, and it's very hard to imagine, and we'll explore this a bit more as I go through, how it would actually splinter in any meaningful sense. But it could break up. And it is already broken up by ideologies and cultures, the geopolitical pressures, and language, actually. We often forget that. But I mean, the fact that there's a Chinese internet for 3/5 of the world, or 4/5 of the world, nobody cares, because nobody can speak Chinese. So they're not looking at it. And the Chinese are largely blocked from looking at the English internet or any, the Western internet by language alone. But there's deeper things that are going on, as we all know, which we'll explore a bit more. So it's already fragmented by language, but we still have the basic technical infrastructure working. And I can talk a bit more about that later, which enables us to effectively email and talk to, run social media across the whole world, access any address at the moment on the internet. You might be blocked when you get there, you might have to pay money when you get there, but you can actually, this is what enabled people to Zoom and TikTok and watch Netflix as we all went into lockdown through COVID, and it saved many lives in that respect and kept people going. I hope the people in China are finding that now. But we've come to a very toxic place as well. People see things on the internet that do great harm, kids and vulnerable adults as well, that we have to worry about, and there's all the security issues. So this is the book that we're talking about, and we've added some stuff. Kieran's added some stuff at the end. We're going to publish a new version of the book, which will have post-21 stuff in it. So the original internet was founded on the concept of openness nearly 50 years ago. Came out of the DARPA project, which was a defense project. It came out of America. Because the idea being that if one site is taken out by a nuclear bomb, but a bomb of some sort, then the rest of the network keeps going. That was the basis of it. But the engineers at the time said, right, we have to make this open so anybody can get onto it. And there were engineering values and political values. And the initial internet was I call it the League of Gentlemen. It was founded by mainly men, like Vint Cerf, Bob Kahn, people, and all around the world, people picked this up as the idea of the 1970s of, I want to be able to email you, and you're going to be like me, so we're all going to be nice to each other. Right? And if someone was not nice in some way, then they were taken aside and told they were being not nice and to behave themselves better. But once email started and spamming started, then we began to realize that bad things were going to happen. But the idea was to get more and more people using the internet. So the technical implementation came with powerful political support. So it was decentralized, permissionless. And this is what Tim picked up on for the World Wide Web, of course. The routing algorithms applied packets indiscriminately. With the concept of net neutrality was very important. And it was open standards for how the protocols, for how the computers interacted with each other. And on the World Wide Web, the protocols for how you actually set up a link and follow it to pick up information from somewhere else. It's all open. And this is where things start to break down, because the other thing was there was no check on content. All right? And that's the big difference about how that's being played out in the world now. On one end, you've got freedom of speech, people in the West, the US and Europe would and others would defend. until someone says something they don't like, and then freedom of speech is out of the window. It's funny that, isn't it? China, of course, the other extreme is where you have complete control over or people looking, the government looking at anything you say. This is also playing out in the Middle East, and the big Chinese culture of being able to look at everything was really when the openness from the very beginning was important. And the Chinese government from the very beginning of the internet was Wu Jianping, who I know very well from Tsinghua University, took the internet into China in 1997. But once the government realized what it could do, it saw it both as a force for good and a force for control. Now, the interesting irony is that in the West, we saw it more as a force for good, but not for control. But because there is no meaningful control of anything, it's become the Wild West, and in some places quite toxic. Right? People do things on the internet they couldn't possibly do in the real world, in the physical world. If I hit you, you're going to call a policeman and have me accused of whatever you call it here. If I bully you on the internet, nothing's going to happen. Or if I encourage you to take drugs or commit suicide, or no one's going to stop me doing that. Well, I mean, we are beginning to think about how we do that, and is the responsibility the government's, the companies, or ours individually, or as society? And of course, it's all three, but it's very complicated. So in some ways, the Chinese internet is a safer place to be because the government has put that control on, but you've got absolutely no freedom of expression. So when it started, and they started to promote the open internet, there were all sorts of things that it had first mover advantage. They provided I've talked about those, the protocols, universal, ubiquitous, open protocols, concept of net neutrality, anyone could do anything, even though it might cost you when you get there, and interoperability as an open issue. And that enabled the innovation, and this is a really important thing, because you could basically, entrepreneurs, eventually people in government, they were slower than the entrepreneurs, picked up the ideas, ran with it, and developed the things that we use all the time today. The ways to shop online, to talk to the government online, to the social media. Of course, Google was one of the first things to develop, to give us the search we needed to find things. But it was an incredible place to innovate. The problem was, though, that like the internet pioneers, Tim gave the World Wide Web protocols away. He didn't try and make money out of it. It would have been a very different world if we'd had to pay for every link. Right? If they hadn't given it away, we would be probably be using the internet. We'd still have it, but we would be using it like we do our mobile phones. You don't think about it, but every time you do something on your mobile phone, you're paying somebody for that. Yeah. We would have been doing that on the internet, all of it. But the decentralization and the openness of it meant anyone could do anything, but they could do bad things as well as good things. And that's the issue that we're grappling with now. So that's the. Sorry, it's the jet lag makes me slow down. I'm really sorry, but I'll get there. So this is some of the problems we're now grappling with because the original internet was open. It enabled it to take off, become worldwide, ubiquitous. But, for example, you could be anonymous on the internet, as we know it. That can lead to incivility. Bias data is not challenged. I mean, look at the arguments we have. Think about COVID and vaccines and the arguments we have. And this data that we're developing is what is used in AI all the time. Nothing to check or verify anything. We've got the evolution of fake news, because of the same issues. We've got all the security issues, the privacy issues, innovations at real scale, this deployed at scale has completely changed the business world. And the key thing to say here is that when businesses, entrepreneurs started inventing things to do on the internet, they didn't know what the business model was completely different because it was free to use. Everybody expected it to continue to be free to use, so wouldn't pay for anything. Okay, this is why everything we use, the apps, initially it's all free. Okay? And how are you paying? You're paying with your data. Because like for the search engines, the online shopping, Netflix, all the things we use all the time, the commercial end of it, the only way to really make money is to have a large network of people use their data to sell them things. And it's all about advertising, and that's completely different. Yes, the world of business was about advertising, but you were selling products, bringing money in, all that profit and loss was people knew how to invest in those sorts of businesses. They didn't know how to invest in these new internet businesses, and that's all grown up. And now we're stuck with a system which is all about using our data to sell things back to us. That might change with Web3, we'll see. Huge diversity issues. I won't go on about them here, but Kieran did the initial version of these slides, and he's put monoculture of white male nerds. I'd just say monoculture of male nerds generally. Silicon Valley is toxic for women. It's just terrible. And interoperability brings you security issues and all the malware. So we argue in the book, and this is where the 4 internets come from, that there have been 4 ethical responses to this open internet. And I'm going to take you through these. So 4 plus 1 is 5, you might say. And we make 4 plus 1 4. Because we think there are 4 cultures to the internet, the underlying Silicon Valley technical protocols. I should say, in case I forget, that the technical protocols are managed by global committees, and protecting those is really important. Keeping those neutral are really important, and there's issues going on with the International Telecoms Union about who manages that and if there might be new protocols for the internet that could. But the technical protocols are still held. So what are these ethical responses? Let me take you through. We have a chapter on each in the book. Whoops, wrong way. So, so the first one that Kieran puts on his slides, I do them in a different order, is the bourgeois response, or the Brussels internet. Oh no, hang on, where's that gone? What's happened here? These slides have got muddled. I think we've lost. All right, I'll go through it this way. I'll skip those out. It's not the way I usually talk about it like this. So, the first ethical response is what we call the Brussels bourgeois internet, and I'm sure you've all heard of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. If you're in Europe, and that includes the UK for these purposes, then we all sign up to GDPR, which is all about data protection, personal data protection. Very, very, very strong laws. And if you want to trade digitally with Europe, you have to conform, which means that my favorite shop in America, I can't buy goods online from because it's a small chain of shops and they don't comply with GDPR. So I fell out of love with GDPR straight away. But anyway, I think it's, in the UK, we're now considering whether to go GDPR light. Because we're now out of Europe, we can think about that. But I don't think anyway, it's totally data protection led, and it's all about protecting human rights in the digital world. Anticipate the problems and neutralize. And they're following that up in Europe, in Brussels, with the European AI Act. And that I can assure you, that sounds too strong, but the UK will not conform. It may conform with the AI Act if it has to deal with when it's trading with mainland Europe, but we are going to have a different sort of regulation. We won't go straight to a legal definition of AI. We're going to do it more in a way that promotes innovation. So that's going to be very interesting. The white paper's due out later this year or early next year on that. So that's the second internet, if you like, the bourgeois Brussels internet. Our third one, rolling around the world, is, as I've talked about, the Chinese. We don't call it authoritarian. We call it paternal, because you could argue, of course, that they're looking after people, and in some ways they do look after people better. As I said, it's a safer world if you don't mind losing the freedom of expression and you don't mind the government looking at all your data. It's a very top-down approach. Any Chinese company, and of course the Chinese, it's big enough to have their own companies, their own everything we have on the west coast of America in Google and Meta and Amazon and eBay. You have similar sorts of companies in China. They have to align with what the government says in China, and a lot of strategic technologies are being built on that basis. China influences, through the Belt and Road Initiative, many other countries, particularly Africa, Eastern Europe, Middle East maybe. So we're seeing how that plays out, but it has a lot of influence on many countries around the world. The fourth internet is what we call the commercial internet. The DC, that's Washington DC, commercial internet. This is where the Americas, where all the companies are based, and it's all about market forces. It's led by basically the companies on the West Coast lobbying and the government on the East Coast for the laws and regulation that will help them grow commercially as companies. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just the driving force. So they will never, I don't think, go for the data protection that Europe's gone for, because of this need to keep the companies afloat, if you like. There are walled gardens, of course. I'm sure you recall the attempts from Facebook to take over the whole internet effectively and make everyone sign up to Facebook and access the internet through Facebook. All the companies would love you just to use be in their world, give them all your data, and that's it. But actually, of course, at the moment, you still have to register with each of the companies. You have all this muddle of which identity you have where, and what information you store where, and so on. I have to take my jacket off. It's quite hot. So that's our fourth internet, the commercial one. And yeah, didn't we say there were 4 responses, ethical responses? Well, our fourth one, and you probably guessed it from the picture, is the hacker. And we credit that to, largely, we call it the Moscow spoiler model. But we don't grant Russia, Moscow, the credit of being another internet, because they're more like parasites. They use the internet to do nasty things to people. They would argue differently, but they promote false news. As do other countries, Iran, and I'm sure you could list more than I can, that deliberately try and stop things happening, feed bad information into the system to get the results that would work better for them, close things down as much as possible. It's not another internet in the sense we're talking about here, but it's a different model for what you might do, and we're seeing it play out at the moment. So we call that one the Moscow spoiler model. No fact-checking, no editing, lots of trolling, fake news, bots, malware. The dark web's interesting, because the dark web, the spies like the dark web, because they can track what people do in the dark web. So they like having all the bad guys in the dark web. But it's a good place for the hackers too. Let's say we call it more parasitic than being a separate internet in its own right. It's not a Russian monopoly, but they are the biggest country that does this. I'm going to talk a bit more about Russia in a minute. Oh, in fact, now, actually, these all come as a surprise to me because this is a new set of slides, but this is what was I going to say then? I'll come back to that at the end. I've got some notes which I've left in my handbag, which is... You got my handbag? Can you just... Because I'm not using my slides. It's all right, we'll be on time. I'm not...
Take all your time.
It's fine. Thank you. It's great. It's your fault because your introduction was so nice. I forgot these. Oh, I can say that. I'll say that at the end. Right, okay. I'll say that at the end. It's okay. Right, so this is the sort of thing that's happened since 2021. And what's exciting for us is that nothing's changed. Our thesis still holds as far as we're concerned, but there might be more internets emerging. And also there's some verification of the way that our thesis about how we categorize the world of the internet. We have, as I say, what we saw, the ideological and geopolitical, the fragmentation of the internet continues. And Kieran makes the point, I hadn't thought about this before, that it's no accident that the internet and the web took off when there was one global superpower. You have to, if we roll back when the web started in 1990, 1991, just think about if it was starting now. How would it, there's a very different world to what it was back then. We hadn't had 9/11, we haven't had the rise of the power of China, haven't had the Ukraine war. So it's a different world. We've had a re-emergence of traditional Eurasian values. China, Russia, Turkey, India are becoming increasingly important on the world stage in a way they weren't 30 years ago. The West is fragmenting. We see a very dysfunctional and polarized US, same in the UK. We've just lost our Queen who pulled it all together, pulled the Commonwealth together. Who knows what's going to happen there? We were a soft power rather than a hard power, but we have here you are, you see this, I'm just saying that this is the Queen, in a way, the Commonwealth pulled all these Anglosphere countries together. That may change. And of course, we've got a war in Europe, which is huge for everybody. Increasing tensions with the US-China trade war. Will China go into Taiwan? The fallout from the pandemic, what did that do? I mean, we all relished the internet at the beginning of the pandemic. But what we see is that the power that governments had in controlling its populations with lockdowns, they aren't shaking those powers off. And we see that, I don't know if you see it here, we see that in the UK, we see it in the US and in Europe. This idea that you can tell people to all go and sit at home and wait it out, all have vaccines, I'm not anti-vax at all. I'm not, this is not a judgment. I'm just saying that these powers that governments have adopted, a lot of them have kept them on the law books because the pandemic continues, even though we're learning to live with it. And we've had Ukraine. We have all sorts of problems with supplies of technology too. So, the war in Ukraine brought us into the whole realm of sanctions on the, if you're going to bring in, so we didn't want Russia to invade Ukraine, we didn't want lots of loss of life. So the reaction was, well, we're not going to start a nuclear war, so let's put sanctions on, all right? Money, sanctions. But what do you do about the internet? And what we've found is it's almost impossible to switch Russia off the internet, say, if that's what you wanted to do. You could possibly do it with China, more so, because China has built itself. They regularly run exercises where they just run the internet in China. Almost no other country in the world, I don't think any other country in the world could do that, because we're all dependent on servers outside of our country and links to servers outside of our country for all sorts of things. Particularly Russia, which uses the internet to do the things it wants to do to fight whatever battles it's trying to fight. And so it's very interconnected. And that works both ways. Our intelligence agencies, by the way, who's here? Is that a Russian spy? Our intelligence agencies... Our intelligence agencies like access to Russia, by the way, as the Russian intelligence agencies like access to the rest of the world. So they're not very keen to have it switched off. And in fact, part of the sanctions, when Russia went into Ukraine, Ukraine asked ICANN to remove Russia from the top-level domains from the DNS, the name server, and it was just impossible to do it. Because the side effects of that, the knock-on effects of that, are absolutely huge. It would make it not just impossible to reach a Russian address, but it would make secure connections impossible. The IP request would mean gradual decay as IP addresses are used up, and it would threaten the entire principles of the open, decentralized management of the internet. So the requests were denied. Quite rightly, I would say, but it just goes to show that we cannot cannot put in sanctions about the use of the internet. Of course, what you can do is bomb, right? You can bomb electricity supplies, which is what Russia's doing in the Ukraine at the moment. And when the electricity goes, the internet goes. But got Elon Musk and his satellites for some of the connectivity. I'll come back to that. Anyway, so it's really shown us that it's really difficult to put in global sanctions on the internet, and Russia's a very small part of it. And as I said, what happens if China invades Taiwan? If the US president says, I can, you've got to switch China off the internet, what do? So there's huge issues here for the diplomats, the lawyers, anyone who deals with global issues. And so much of what we do these days, I mean, if we want cooperation for climate change, for organized crime, for refugees, for food protection, all these things require the internet to let people talk. And you have the same problem if we can't cut China and India and other big countries out of the climate change discussions. Makes no sense. And I would argue it's exactly the same about the internet. So even if you're at war with a country, you need to be able to talk to them about how you manage the internet. That's really difficult. It's a very different type of dilemma to maybe what happened at the beginning of World War II. God, this is getting very depressing. I shouldn't keep... Now, what else is happening? And the two countries that... many countries are thinking about building up autonomous national internet stacks because of this issue. And Russia, for example, has... RUNET is their internal internet, and they have... they've been trying to break away from the main internet for a long time for the same sorts of reasons as China, to keep their population under control. And they've run exercises. We don't believe they've done it successfully. And before we really could find out, the Ukraine war happened, and we had COVID and then the Ukraine war. But so we don't, again, we don't think about what Russia's doing as a separate internet, but there's so much interconnectedness that, as I said before, it's really difficult for one country. They're trying to develop their own cloud companies, their own information spaces, their own government services. We'll see how that works out over time, maybe. I mean, who knows what's going to happen. But the big thing, we have a whole chapter on the book on India. And I just want to say something about numbers here, which is what I wanted these notes for. If you add up the population today, if everybody had access to the internet today, well, let's roll back one. At the moment, about 60% of the world has access to the internet, on estimates. So there's 40% of the world still to come onto the internet, in simplistic terms. And where is it going to grow? It's got to grow in the big rural areas. So rural China, rural India, and rural Africa. Rural China, we know which way the China internet's going to go. It's not going to be any different. Rural Africa is hugely influenced by China because of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we call India, rural India. India is nearly as big, 1.4 billion, as China. They're both about 1.4 billion. And India's done the most amazing things digitally, particularly through their national identity system, the Aadhaar number. They've given everyone a digital identity. So if you're in the middle, the farthest away from Delhi, in rural India, and you don't know when you were born, you've got an ID, which you couldn't do before. And that's enabled all sorts of things to happen, and good social, give people money during COVID. They got it through their Aadhaar number. They can do digital banking. But it also gives the government much more control over what's happening. And it really depends how, I think of India as a democratic country, but verging on the autocratic. And it really depends, just like we're seeing in Brazil at the moment, if you've been looking at the elections in Brazil, this is happening all over the world. It's really, democracy versus authoritarianism is playing out everywhere. And if India went the same sort of way as China on the internet, then you'd have, I did the sums, India, China, the Middle East and Africa are 4 billion people, and the US, Europe and South America are 1.6 billion. So you'd have an internet dominated by authoritarian governments. I don't know, Singapore is a little island that I don't even talk about here. I haven't put Southeast Asia on my list here. I should, but again, it will depend. If we are just thinking about, we in the West tend to think that everybody uses the internet like we do, but we could be the tiniest part of the internet in the future. And anyway, so. It could be a very different, just like climate change is affecting the world. This could affect all sorts of things about how we how we manage the internet in our different countries. The way things are going in China's having its own problems with its big companies. I've got an eye on the clock. I'm just going to come up to finishing. Developing AI, face recognition, social credit scores, all these things. Now, something that's coming is metaverse. I've stopped saying the metaverse because there isn't going to be one metaverse. There's going to be multiple of them. And people confuse. They think, they have the metaverse like we have the internet. It will not be like that. It's all commercial, different companies trying to have you in their metaverse, and they'll all be commercial, you'll have to pay, and there's no regulation, and boy is it worrying to me about how that's going to play out. Anyway, so also happening, we've got stuff in the US, but the one I just want to finish with is we've got the Trump and the Supreme Court and the cases that are going through at the moment about censorship and so on. Might the US go paternal? But this is the last one, the last example. Elon Musk, such a strange character, one of the richest guys in the world through the internet, through the web. He's just actually bought Twitter. I'm sure you saw on the news, he moved in with his sink last week, sacked the bosses, is supposedly going to sack 75% of the employees. I've always thought he wanted it in order to bring Trump back, so that Trump wins the next election. I've always thought that was his main plan. He supposedly champions free speech and openness. He's pro-commercial, he's anti-Brussels, he's tolerant of Muslims. He's a very complicated man who seems to hold views that clash. His opinion will matter. Although Twitter's a tiny company compared to the rest of them, this is going to pivot things around, and I think this was on. I think here. I think Oh no. I think he wants to build. How many of you use WeChat? I use WeChat when I'm in China. This is the Chinese application that is more like a WhatsApp, but you can pay. Use the WePay, and you do everything on WeChat basically. I think he wants to build Twitter into the WeChat of the West. I think that's what he's going to do. So he'll have a commercial thing, and he goes backwards and forwards on his satellites as well to use them. He offers them to Ukraine, and then he takes them back again because he starts to support Russia. So it's a bit difficult to know how it's going to go, but his opinion is going to matter. So this is an ongoing story that I'm going to finish at this point. I would just like to say that we believe this plays out into the AI world. And I give another talk about AI when I give a little bit of this talk and say, actually, the way AI regulation is going, it will follow these sorts of, what's the word I want? Trends. And that's, AI regulation is going to be as important, if not more important, than internet regulation. So, we've really got to keep an eye on this. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, thank you.
I hope I made sense despite the jet lag.
No, thank you very much. Let's give Professor Dame Wendy a round of applause. Yeah.